which do you prefer? Do you prefer the mono or the stereo mix?
Do I prefer the mono or the stereo? So that's a tough question because it really oftentimes depends on the song. The Beatles, of course, mix in mono, and some songs really come out well. The mono, for example, Lucy in the Sky, is a lot more trippy sounding, I think, than the stereo version, because they did something, some of the effects coming out in mono, they come out stronger than when things are separated. There are other songs which are completely different in stereo than they are in mono, and I like them better. For example, Helter Skelter, if you listen in mono, it never fades back in again. You never hear, I've got blisters on my fingers. It just sort of ends. Ooh. And of course in stereo it comes back and you have the, Ringo say, I've got blisters on my fingers and so forth. So sometimes it's fun to hear them both. Yeah, so I listen to both.
But Pepper, which one do you like?
Oh, Pepper?
Yeah.
If you force my hand, I'd have to say the mono version of Pepper. I'd have to say, yeah, and probably on vinyl.
Have Paul or Ringo heard or seen your movie, and have they commented?
Have Paul or Ringo seen my movie? As far as I know, they have not seen it unless they snuck in incognito. We did, actually, when I was approached about filming my lectures, one of my conditions was I don't want to do it and find out that Apple is going to sue me. So we talked to the lawyers, we figured out a way that we can use the music, and there's an awful lot of music and video and so forth in there. And we made sure that we can use it all, but I wanted to make sure that Apple, they can sue for any reason. So we talked to Jeff Jones, who's the president of Apple, and he said, we're not going to sue you for this is fine, and have fun with it. So because of that, because of other people I've met who know Paul or know John or know Yoko or what have you, I know Ringo knows about it. I'm not as sure about Paul, but so far they haven't emailed me yet.
A couple questions. The access to the 4 tracks, the bounced 4 tracks, I just assumed that you had all that because you had an arrangement with Apple to get a hold of all that. And so that apparently is not the case.
So the question is about all the 4 tracks I use. So this is all material that I have collected from various sources. And also I do a lot of processing in my studio at home, so there's some things you can do with different versions of the Beatles recordings. There's a rock band, video game, there's the Cirque du Soleil Love CD, there are various other things that have been released in different formats, and so I do a lot of manipulation, but I always try and stay true to the track sheets and what was documented in the recording. So I use it to illustrate points that I'm making, but I would love to have access one day to the real 4 tracks.
So to your knowledge, because whenever you see these things, you always see the bounced versions, but to your knowledge, were the original 4-track tapes also preserved somewhere?
Were the original 4-track tapes preserved? So certainly as the Beatles grew in stature, they were preserved, and they're at Abbey Road. As far as we know, yes, they're preserved. Early on, recording tape was expensive, and no one thought that the Beatles would be this phenomenon. So there were quite a few recordings that were lost. But there's an awful lot out there, and the latest rumor that I heard back in 2003, was it? They released, or maybe 2008, they released some official bootlegs. And they did this to protect their copyright. So they went on iTunes, there were no liner notes or anything, they released them, and then very quickly afterwards they pulled it. They didn't do anything for 64, 65. The rumor is that there just wasn't a lot more in the vaults. But the plan is now, or what I'm hearing through the grapevine, is that there's going to be a release for bootlegs for 66. So there are things that will come out officially. Ultimately, they will open up their vaults, I hope. And there's an awful lot that's in collector circles for various reasons. And so I do have some 4 tracks, but a lot of the other stuff is kind of reconstructed.
What of these things came from oral histories that have been told you by people like Jeff Jesperson?
So what of these come from oral histories? So I read an awful lot of Beatles books from every angle whatsoever, and I try to use first-person stories. When there is debate, like the fixing the whole story, I'll try and say, we don't know, or these are some options. But most of my focus is on the music, and the music doesn't lie. You know, if you hear Mick Jagger singing on a recording, you can hear his voice, he's on the recording. So whatever the Beatles books say, I know he's there because I hear him. So I try and spend most of my time focusing on the music and listening very carefully and making sure that when I look at the recording process, that I can document that by audio that I actually have. Okay, just a few more.
You talked about recording at half speed and then speeding it up. And I guess there's a difference then between recording at regular speed and speeding up to double?
So you're talking about half speed recording and so forth. So what's the difference between recording half speed and speeding it to normal versus starting normal and then speeding it up? And the short answer is there's not really a difference, but it all has to do with how you play it back, what speed you play it back on. So on Revolver and on Pepper, they're doing an awful lot of speeding up certain things and slowing down other things and then playing it back at a completely different speed. So everything sounds different than the way it was actually recorded. And you hear that on songs like I'm Only Sleeping on Revolver, where the drums, the bass, the guitar have been recorded fast and slowed down. The vocals have been recorded with the tape running slow and sped up. And what that does is it creates this sound where everything is slightly off. You know, Strawberry Fields is another one where if you really listen, things sound a little different, and that has to do with this speeding up and slowing down. So it really depended on what they were doing for that particular song.
And it messes with the keys and the notes,
It
too.
messes with the keys and notes. Yeah, if you ever try and figure out a Beatles song, especially around this time period, oftentimes, you know, it's like between B flat and B, but it's neither key. That's because of this. Hey, I got a question for Peter here, if I can ask one. So one of my favorite Replacements albums is Let It Be, right? So that was a pretty bold move. And I'm just wondering, you know, first of all, tell me about what the Replacements thought of the Beatles, and then do you know anything about why they chose that title for that album?
Well, I think they chose the title for the album to piss me off because they thought I was too devoted to the Beatles. And in fact, Paul Westerberg used to say, you know, they're a great rock band, they're not the only rock band. And at other times he would argue with me that the Rolling Stones were better, which, you know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. As far as why they, or as far as what they felt about the Beatles, I mean, they all loved them. I mean, it was especially interesting to me that Bob Stinson, the original lead guitar player, had certainly known Beatle records, but had kind of pushed them aside, and he was famously known for liking a lot of progressive rock. Steve Howe was one of his favorite guitar players, for instance, and I remember having to get him into an Asia concert one time, but later on through you just hanging around with me a whole lot, I think he was reintroduced to the Beatles and he became obsessed with them, and that's one of those things that I remember most fondly about Bob, who's no longer alive, but yeah, so they were all fans for sure.
Wow. Great.
But that's a funny question, thank you.
All right, just a few more. Yes.
Yeah, which of the biographies, you know, do you like the anthology, do you like the Bob Spitz biography? What do you recommend that people read?
So there are thousands of books on the Beatles. It's amazing. I mean, literally, there are books on Beatles books. That's how crazy it is. No exaggeration. So it really depends on what you're looking for. If you want a good book that talks about the Beatles in relation to the culture and what was going on around the time, I really like Can't Buy Me Love by Jonathan Gould and The Long and Winding Road by Kenneth Womack. If you're looking for first person or books that talk more about the Beatles and what went on, you know, certainly the Beatles anthology is the way they would like to present their story. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of really, really great stuff in there. And then there's what was I going to say? There are a bunch of biographies on the individual Beatles and so forth. I really like, of course, Jeff Emmerich's book, Here, There, and Everywhere, which also has a lot of mistakes in it, but has some really great stories. And then Ken Scott, who engineered part of Mystery Tour and the White Album, has a book called From Abbey Road to Ziggy Stardust. Those are slightly more focused on the production and the technical stuff, but very, very interesting. And then the gospel in terms of the recording sessions, Kahu and Ryan's recording the Beatles, and of course Mark Lewison's Beatles recording sessions, which is I think out of print, but it's great. And then of course he's writing a 3-part biography of the Beatles. The first part came out a few years back, and the deluxe edition is 2,000 pages, of which about 200 pages are just footnotes, and it only goes up to 1962. So the next volume is supposed to come out, I think, in 2018, and there's one more, but that's the most researched book ever.
And we don't know when the part 2 is coming out.
I think 2018.
2018.
Yes.
I think
yes.
in that book, one of my favorite factoids was wrapping up in December of '62 when they're trying to put everything in perspective, and they mentioned that the Rolling Stones played their first gig on December 12th or something with Bill Wyman, effectively, the first classic lineup intact. And at that time, they estimated that the Stones had played about 35 gigs. At that same time, the Beatles had played approximately 900 gigs. That's one of my favorites. The Mark Lewison book is amazing. So it's called Tune In.
I was there in Malibu this morning, and I think a group of us are here. I just wanted to put my heart out to you, what you're doing, and I appreciate the invite tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I was in Malibu surfing this morning, and you obviously like my surfing, so thanks very, very much. Yes.
I heard what you said about removing Gandhi from the cover art. I'm wondering, how were the other people chosen, and who are they?
How were the people chosen on the Sgt. Pepper cover? So the Beatles all got to make lists of people, and they range from Sonny Liston to Bob Dylan to teachers that the Beatles had, H.G. Wells,
Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe. It's a whole assortment that each Beatle, I think, got to contribute. I think George picked some gurus and so forth. And there were some people who didn't make it. In fact, one of the pictures I have shows Hitler on the side. That was John's choice. And I think John was just being John. So Marlene Dietrich famously said, "Why would I be in a Lonely Hearts Club Band?" But the issue was they didn't get permission for any of this. And when EMI saw the cover, they freaked. And they made the Beatles write to every person and get permission. And there was one guy whose name I can't remember who refused. And
Leo
so-
Dorsey from the Bowery Boys?
Yes. So he was whitewashed out, Gandhi was whitewashed out, and there might have been one other person, and then there were a couple others who didn't, their cardboard cutouts didn't make it in. How about one more question? All the way up there.
Do you think the music on this album and the later albums would have been different if they weren't planning on touring?
Do I think the music would have been different if they had been touring, you mean? Absolutely. There is no way they could have reproduced any of this live. And starting with Revolver, what this idea of pushing touring aside meant was that they were free to do anything they wanted without having to worry about how are we going to play this live. And I think it was very freeing for them. I think it opened up a lot of possibilities. And I do think that's why you have some of these classic albums, because they weren't saddled with the worry of how do you put this on live. So, thank you all. Thank you, Peter. Scott.